Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, yay, hi. Hi everyone, welcome to NFT Art and the Avant-Garde. I'm Tess Pollok. These are the people I got to do this with me. We each have an introductory panel, so everyone's gonna get the chance to talk a little bit more about their work, and then we're gonna get into just the aesthetics of these projects and what we think some of the challenges are with digital art. And yeah, that's about the introduction. So I'll take us right into Parker. Parker, do you wanna just do an introduction about your work?
Sure. Yeah, so in college, I got really obsessed with the internet, and I started meeting all these artists on the internet, and kind of got involved in this net art scene. And eventually that sort of net art scene moved into the mainstream art world, and kind of became known as something called post-internet. The same time that post-internet was happening, there was a sort of stylistic movement called zombie formalism that was also happening in the art world, which was like sort of young artists who were making a specific style of abstraction. And it got a lot of media coverage because it was painting that was being heavily speculated on and flipped. So there was sort of like pump and dump schemes, essentially. And so when post-internet was sort of happening in the mainstream art world, I was sort of more associated with the zombie formalism thing, even though I came up with all the post-internet people. And so yeah, I've sort of was just working in the traditional art world, and then in 2023, I got asked to do an NFT project. I had no knowledge of NFTs at the time, in terms of like what was happening. And yeah, I did this project, and I got really into this Solana scene, which has a couple different names. One of the names is Avant NFT. It's also been referred to as gay NFT. That's sort of the more common name and what people call it in the scene. And yeah, basically, to kind of tie into where we are right now at this festival and this talk, I think what's happening in the Solana NFT scene is like the contemporary avant-garde. And when I was sort of in college, part of this net art scene, I really believed in a kind of contemporary avant-garde, but as I transitioned into the art world and sort of became disillusioned, I really stopped believing in that. And so yeah, that's kind of why I'm here, my story.
Great, thank you so much, Parker. I'd love to introduce you all to our next speaker, Maya.
Hi, I'm Maya, also an artist. Yeah, I kind of feel like I grew up looking at a lot of artists who were part of the net art and post-internet art universe, and I have a background in computer science and media studies, so for me, I've primarily always made work that's software-based, and as I was sort of starting my career, I was starting to make a lot of generative work, so work that is JavaScript-based and has an element of randomness to it, and I was really specifically interested in work about internet culture, and ideas around the self online, and all of this kind of aligned with the emergence of the NFT movement at large, which has a lot of subsets, and I think we'll get into it. But yeah, I think for me that was really exciting because it was a way that you could share generative work that felt truly native to like a software-based form. And I think I also always had made websites as art objects, and that was very natural for me, but figuring out how to sort of build a practice and a career where you're able to, yeah, be part of an art world has always been like a difficult challenge for people who work with a medium that sort of isn't easy to contain in some way. And so, yeah, I've released a lot of different generative projects, mostly on Ethereum, but I'm big fans of Parker and Jared's work and excited to be here. So and I think there's a lot to discuss. together. So,
Yay, thank you, Maya.
yeah.
And our next speaker is do you prefer Makayla Caps or Makayla Bailey?
Bailey.
Makayla Bailey, ignore the caps. Our next speaker is Makayla Bailey. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your work with Rhizome?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Makayla Bailey. I'm an independent writer and curator, executive leader, working across traditional art worlds, so formerly like MoMA, Studio Museum, New Museum, and Digital Art World. So I was most recently the co-executive director of Rhizome at the New Museum, which is a digital arts nonprofit founded in 1996, as some of you may know, or many of you may know. And in 2014, Rhizome paired the pair that would make what some consider to be the first NFT at their 7-on-7 conference. So yeah, that's good. That's a good place to start.
Great, thank you so much, Makayla. For our next, I think the next one is, oh yeah. And we have Jared.
Hey, I'm Jared Madere. I'm an artist, curator, and recently, I guess, a founder. I, similar to I think everyone here, have been making digital art since I was a kid, and that since 2016, that's been really focused on AI, media synthesis stuff. In addition to my work as an artist, I've also ran a number of galleries, most recently Gallery Yetchi Lang in New York with Wretched Worm, Miles, and that began as an exclusively online thing. We started working on it in 2021, launched in 2022, and the impetus of that at first began as a kind of a cross-pollination thing, which was bringing on trad artists and getting them to make NFTs. And over the evolution of the gallery, it's become more and more crypto native. I think that had to do a lot with, in 2021, you could have these projects, like a friend of mine was talking with Tom Sachs in 2021. He was like, what's an NFT? And my friend's like, you just put one out 2 weeks ago. Like there was this thing of trad artists jumping in because of, New York Times was like, Beeple, 69 mil, you want to do this. So since then, I think there's been this shift where in order to participate in it, you have to be immersed in the timeline constantly. You have to really be familiar with the fabric of crypto and be baptizing yourself daily in the culture, understanding the mechanics of it, all this, for better or for worse. And I think our movement as a gallery has reflected that. And when we opened a physical location in New York last year, that kind of became, the original mission had a chance to flesh itself out again, in that our mission there is to, I'm sure a lot of you have this experience where you have friends that have nothing to do with this world and it's completely opaque to them. So we have all these projects that are super significant to our culture. Like the one that reared its head most obviously for the gallery was this project called Drafella 2 that was extremely influential and really turned a lot of structural conventions on their head. And we at the gallery really firmly believed this was the most exciting image-making conversation on Earth in the last 20 years, most exciting painting conversation, whatever. And all of our friends that don't know how to navigate a secondary exchange, it's completely opaque to. So the mission for the gallery became, okay, how can we expose the flesh and blood world that don't have Twitter handles to everything that's going on in this culture, and cherry pick the things we're most excited about from the trad world and mix those together. And simultaneously, that was always this really curated thing. In the spring, Miles, myself, Wretched Worm, and Fairy Baby 420 have all been building this NFT deployment platform called FWB that if you look at the projects Yechi has done, especially in our online incarnation, they're all hyper bespoke minting experiences. A lot of them are these three-dimensional environments that you can navigate. Everything's super custom. You know, we started off in the Ethereum meta when it was like, if you didn't have a custom contract and a super tricked out site, don't bother talking about it. And when all the motion in our scene switched over to Solana last year, there was this thing where everyone was forced to deploy on these really generic platforms like Launch My NFT, Truffle, this kind of thing. So FWB, the impetus of it was to give artists the same level of control that you would have if you were working one-on-one with a really brilliant dev, but give everyone that level of customizability from the aesthetic aspects of their minting experience, but also technical, this kind of thing. And this on the screen, this is not mine, this is Jim Spindle. This is a collection we did called Scarecrows with him. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with his collection, Little Fellow, that's, they're all kind of scenes within heads, like, how do you pronounce it, Matryoshka?
Oh yeah, I think Matryoshka.
Yeah, it's kind of like this with the scene in Men in Black where there's a little dude inside the Russian guy's skull. So there's kind of these cathedral architectures inside these skulls.
Great, thank you so much, Jared. So the last person to introduce themselves would be me. I'm Tess Pollok. I'm the editor of Animal Blood magazine. We're a contemporary art and literature magazine established in 2021. The genesis of this whole talk, actually, is that we recently featured Parker as part of our Craft Talks with Artists series, and our audience really responded and seemed extremely interested in the NFT projects he was talking about. So we started talking about doing a panel about it. We do a lot of events in New York and LA revolving around basically just the contemporary artists we work with. So a lot of digital artists, a lot of post-internet artists. And we do, I would say we're like 50-50 in the NFT space and sort of digital art space, and then in the literature space. So I've built out a series of panels here, or a series of slides, and we're just gonna move through each question. And for you guys, they're just sort of jumping off points, and I made them as sort of generic and comprehensive as possible to ignite your imaginations. So here we go. So I think Parker and Maya talked to you guys about this one a little bit before the talk, but I know, Parker, you wanted to talk about Hashlips, and I was wondering what programs you guys use in procedurally generated art, or what do you see as the future of the creation of digital art?
Yeah, Hashlips is a pretty popular one. There's a lot of programs that are sort of similar to it, but I think what is interesting about Hashlips is the kind of way that it's been adopted by the Solana scene and sort of what sort of happened to it. So this is a collection called Self-Driving Megaworms, made by a guy called Xanthrax ID. And this is a really good example of like what is called trait maxing, which is a sort of aesthetic that's become associated with the Solana scene. And, you know, as like NFTs kind of were developed, like you have a tool like Hashlips that's used. Just to kind of explain what that is, it's like a compiler tool. And so imagine like separate folders with different traits in them. So you'd have like a folder that's just eyes, and then a folder that's just nose, and a folder that's just mouth. And then you can compile those all together and create variations on those, but it never repeats the same variation, right? So you can, it's a way to generate a lot of images really quickly. And yeah, so like there's sort of like, you know, think of a collection like CryptoPunks or Apes. Like this is a really good example of like these PFP collections. So there's like a profile picture collection. And like as the kind of the experimentation with Hashlips evolves, you start to have people in the Solana scene completely kind of obliterate the legibility of like a kind of central character in PFP. And that's this trait maxing thing where you're like using all of these assets and just like layering them on top of each other and making these sort of hyper dense collages. Jared, do you want to talk about that at all? Or?
Yeah, like Parker was saying, the Hashlips is an interesting piece of software, and I think the thing that's most interesting about it in our scene is the way it's abused, meaning this is software that originally was released for, I mean, it's open source, so even calling it released is a little weird, but it was originally created to make things like Bored Apes or Pudgy Penguins or whatever, where you have like, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance you get the pinwheel hat. There's a 1 in 2,000 chance you get the gold fur. There's a 1 in 100 chance you get the leopard print fur, whatever, the 3D glasses, the monocle, whatever. And so you get the idea. It's like a pretty conservative style of image making, and the revelation there was with that collection, Drafella 2, in that it really abused the mechanism, and you had these layers that didn't line up. You'd have faces that didn't exist that were just hinted at by the form of 2 Margiela shoes, like slanted in a way that vaguely resembled a chin. So it's this kind of like deconstruction of a PFP, but then, I mean, it's also like very not academic. I think that's a really interesting thing about this scene, that culturally, as someone that came up in like the same time as Parker, it was really like if you wanted to be a significant player in contemporary art, 99% of people had formal educations in it. You had to live in a coastal city or Berlin or London or Paris or this kind of thing. And this is an interesting thing because this scene, it's really interesting to me comparing the people I came up with in New York and how so many of the people that are involved in this live in pretty isolated locations that are not cultural hubs at all, but they're much more aesthetically and culturally sophisticated and nuanced than the people that I came up with in Chinatown in New York. And you see that with these kind of collections where the number of ideas that are getting stacked with visual representations of them, it's like very Byzantine and hyper layered. And that was super influential last year. I think the other thing that was starting to happen is people were starting to mess around with AI and more, like myself and Worm have been up to that since the second this stuff reared its head in like 2021, 2022. But there used to be a much higher barrier to entry unless you were using off-the-shelf tools. And now I think more and more people are starting to experiment. I get one other thing I should mention. I think this might already have made itself obvious. The scene is very heavy on image-making conversations as opposed to not a lot of code-based work at all. There's some of that, but I kind of bring that up in relationship to what I was saying about the background of a lot of these people. Instead of having formal arts educations or computer science or anything like that degrees, a lot of them come from backgrounds like their parents owned comic book shops, or they're kind of invested in that sort of visual vocabulary. And so now people are pivoting more to these AI tools like Comfy UI, where I don't know if anyone here has experimented with that stuff, but you can go incredibly deep, where if you imagine any process that you would ever do in Blender or Photoshop or any image-making software, you can completely create basically agents that perform very complex decision-making tasks. You can have things that detect elements of images, select them, reinterpolate on top of them, and create these incredibly complex chains that are like setting up a child and telling it to make images on your behalf. And I think that people are combining that with tools like Hashlips. And I think as far as image making tools go, I see a lot of things flowing in that direction, also flowing in cruder directions. Like there's a collection that was put out in the scene, the sequel to Spiky DJ, and that's all little lumps of clay with pennies shoved in them for eyes and like pencils jabbing them and really crude MS Paint style backgrounds and this kind of stuff. So I think there's like there's a certain interest in crude ways of production, but then also people are getting more into using these more like advanced technical tools to abuse them and create things like this, where like most of the images in self-driving megaworms have dicks for nose, but it's made using pretty complex tech.
And I have a question about Hashlips, because you mentioned that it's like a folder for the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and then you talked about trait maxing, but do you guys ever see it used in the creation of just scenes, or does it specifically relate to the PFP format? Like, does it make objects?
You can do anything with it.
Do you see that done?
Because you make the assets yourself and then just load them into the program, right?
Are there examples you can think, like?
I mean, I'm working on one right now.
Really?
It's like a room with a bunch of objects in it. I mean, I guess like what the Tojiba guys have done.
True.
So like the altars would be a good example of sort
All
of like
of the Tojiba stuff.
it's kind of like rooms or
it's all
has space.
Hashlips.
And it's all Hashlips, yeah.
Actually, no, you know what? They didn't know how to use Hashlips when the first one came out, and it's all Photoshop actions.
Right.
But they behave the same way as Hashlips.
Yeah, because Hashlips you have to code, so it is kind of technical.
I'm wondering if we should zoom out a little bit and think about there's a role that these programs play, but the real, why are we creating procedurally generated digital art? Why are we iterating on things that would, ideally, or if you think about Walter Benjamin, art in the age of mechanical reproduction, right? You have an object that can be printed out, and you have an object that has an aura. Historically, the thing that has the painters laboring over it has the aura. These might be digital ways to create that aura, but why are we, and where does this come from? Thinking of Warhol's silk screens with his soup cans, thinking of his images of Marilyn Monroe, thinking of seriality in art in general, and as a way of creating value, as opposed to, the innovation within the Solana scene.
Yeah, I think it's really actually something I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years is how all of the artists who are releasing NFT collections, sort of the mechanisms at play for you to release an NFT collection imposes this really specific framework for thinking about making a new work. And so in all the projects that you guys are talking about, and I feel like this too, because in the generative art community, people who are writing JavaScript-based algorithms to produce an artwork, sort of what for a long time has been the most popular way of production is to write an algorithm and then say that algorithm has X number of outputs. Early on, it was closer to 1,000, or for a PFP project, 10,000. And when you think about art making and the history of art making, that's an insanely high number of works, but the NFT ecosystem has imposed this sort of, also this market structure that's really interesting and really different from the trad art world, where you are able to put out a body of work that has a super high number of editions and then have many collectors of that kind of work. But it also has, I think for me, I've realized over the past few years, because I kind of started out making websites as art objects, one website, one domain name, it's running the code, it's visual, but that's the work. And participating in the NFT scene forced me to think about how to slice and dice one algorithm in a way. Or rather than making one single artwork, you think about, okay, how can I build a collection of something? And that's something I've been trying to reconcile a bit, because it's quite unusual in the history of making work that you're thinking about making such a high number of outputs and imposing this way of making that is procedural. And so, yeah, I'm kind of curious. I think this question about how this software shapes the work is that now all of these artists are like, I'm gonna make a new work, including me. I'm gonna make a new work, and how do I fit it into this structure? And the structure is totally defined by the way that the NFT ecosystem operates. Yeah, and I think for me a little bit, I've been trying to figure out how to balance that and how to sometimes do that, and then also remember I can make things that exist outside of that structure too, so it's not sort of the only imposed framework.
Also, like a thing that has plagued or benefited digital art since the beginning is like what you were talking about with like who if you don't have a Twitter handle, is this totally opaque to you, right? And it's like how much of this scene or of any kind of form of digital cultural production is at the behest of being legible to people or introducing itself to people perennially who don't know what's going on versus being caught in that kind of insider baseball. And I think that's where like, we're at the crux of, potentially really interesting things, maybe with the mass adoption of AI, although I will say like AI used to also be like Clippy the paperclip in Microsoft Word, or like whoever knew how to hyphenate a word from one line to another, that was also AI. So we just need to like keep things a little bit grounded too.
Yeah, I think all three of you are actually speaking in different ways about the democratization, how it affects the accessibility. And I think that that's interesting because Maya, you brought up that it's sort of unprecedented to iterate works on this scale. But like, I think throughout art's history, many like famous art, like Rembrandt had understudy, and people fill out those paintings all the time. So in the past, it used to be that you'd have to be like an exceptionally visible, successful artist who would have studio assistants who would then sort of reproduce your work. And I think the democratization like aspect of it is that now a working class artist could have the ability to iterate their own work without that labor.
Well, I think for me, like I'm a very big Albert Dürer fan who was working during the Renaissance, and Dürer kind of worked in painting, watercolor, but what he's primarily known for is his contributions to printmaking, and his most famous works are print, and the sort of experts actually don't know how many Albert Dürer prints there are in the world, which is like a really interesting way to think about how we think about masterpieces, right? As usually kind of like singular sort of works, singular sort of moments, right? But essentially Dürer kind of like all the contributions that Warhol made, I feel like Dürer made, when he was working in the 13th century or whatever. And I feel like this, for me, is a kind of like a great parallel on how to think about NFTs in production and contemporary art, and that maybe, we should understand these things as not sort of singular sort of moments, but nodes in a larger network, and we're kind of always aware that they exist within that. And I think, for me, that's why it's like such a kind of radical proposition to, make a collection that can be as large. I mean, the standard for a long time was 10K. That's not kind of the trend right now in the Solana scene that we're a part of. But even like, I make paintings. Like I come from a traditional object-based art background, and like, you have an exhibition, like even making 10 paintings is a lot. So to make 10,000 is like kind of insane.
I like thinking about it as notes in a larger, that makes sense to me, seeing it as notes in a larger work. Do you guys want to move on to the next slide unless anyone had any pressing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I say something about the democratization part?
Yeah, go ahead.
Also, I'm going to preface this by, I'm going to use a word that I really hate using, which is community. If anyone has a way of making it so I'd never have to say that again, I'd love to hear that suggestion. But I think one thing that's really interesting in this democratization conversation is there's so many artists that are also become collectors, and the way that people become artists is really interesting. We have a couple people that have come through the gallery that really made an impression on me in this way. One is an NFT artist, Dido, Didos from Belarus, and he was living in Belarus about a year and a half ago, and I don't know if anyone knows I'm sure there are people here who aren't particularly familiar with the political situation in Belarus, but it's pretty ruthless. Like, all of his friends, he had to like go to a mental asylum to not be drafted, and all of his friends were like locked up and tortured for protesting the president that has been the president for 20 years. And he was doing dev work for US-based law firms and saw a post on Twitter by someone named Napalm Fart. And the post was basically, quit your job, trade Solana meme coins. And he was like, that sounds cool, I hate my job. And made an NFT collection, did pretty well, moved to New York.
Soulfus is the collection.
Yeah, Soulfus. And there's also Soulfus Sisters, right?
Yeah.
There's a few.
Yeah.
There's a few sequels. And I thought that was a really incredible story. But then another one that was really like cinematic. There was this kid that came by the gallery last August that he had just moved to New York with $115 from Brussels, and he was sleeping on a bench and showering at Planet Fitness, like storing his clothes in a locker, and his whole game was selling NFTs on Zora, and he would do dailies and he's like, sometimes I make $6 a day, sometimes I make 160, but he was supposed to come back to the gallery, and he broke his laptop sleeping on it in the rain. So I hope he's okay. But yeah, if anyone knows anything about this character, would love an update.
Love that.
But yeah, it was really inspiring because it was such a no one does that. That's like a movie about New York from the 70s. You know what I mean?
Totally. Well, I think that takes us pretty fluidly into our next question, which is similarly related to the democratization of that. But where do we find significant projects, or how do you find these projects that interest you?
I mean, it's kind of annoying, but you just have to be on Twitter.
Yeah.
That it's like, when I explain this scene to people, and then they're like, oh, where can I see it? VVV and Yechi, Jared's platform and gallery, that's kind of the center of the scene, I feel like. So VVV would be a good place, vvv.so, be a good place to look at different projects associated with this. But
Yeah, I think you really do. If you're going to be making or collecting or part of any NFT world right now, you have to be on Twitter. And I think it's a frustration. But I don't know who loves it, but I think a lot of people don't love it. It's
having to post.
Yeah, having to post all the time. And that for me has been the hardest part about putting out NFT collections, is I don't like to feel like I need to promote and share my own work. Especially on Twitter, it just feels bad. And so but I think there's been sort of pushes for different scenes to move elsewhere, but it still remains I think for all of the different NFT scenes, where you do go to find out about what's happening, what's releasing, where you can assume artists are sharing their work. So it still reigns.
I love that. I love that the first slide ignited a long conversation, and the second slide is it's Twitter. We all agree it's just Twitter. Costs associated with digital art. I know that there's a big conversation around projects on Ethereum versus projects on Solana. Do you see aesthetic differences in those projects? And we could even broaden this just beyond that in how do you see different mechanisms for digital art even beyond the world of NFTs? How do you see them having different creative trajectories, I guess?
Can you repeat the last half of that?
Sorry?
Can you repeat the last half of
Well,
that?
I was just thinking about your work, Maya, and how you don't really make NFTs, but you're still working with code-based art. So I was just trying to open it up to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've put out a few NFT collections, but they're all on Ethereum.
They're on Ethereum.
Yeah, and I think kind of like you were describing, there was this movement from most like fine art NFTs being on Ethereum, and then like a subset moved really toward Solana. But I think especially for people who are making software-based work, like writing their own custom code and custom algorithms, which is primarily what I do, that's happening on Ethereum. And I don't know, I think there's been this tension that I'm really interested in from the very beginning of like between the trad art world and what's happening in NFTs and what's happening on Ethereum and now Solana, which I think Solana now represents a much more specific subculture. But I think there's been a tension between, do we want to mimic the mechanisms of the trad art world and become that? Or do we want to, in the beginning, there was a lot of defiance and like excitement about shared disillusionment with the trad art world, especially if you make work that doesn't operate well in like the gallery system there, and you make digital work, there wasn't sort of an obvious path for you. But what I see now more and more is that there's this desire for artists to, and maybe collectors too, in these different platforms, that they want the validation of operating in a way that is more analogous to the trad art world. And I think that's more on Ethereum, but I think there's just been this tension for a long time between like, do we take advantage of what is possible in digital space and with NFTs and kind of do things differently, or is there validation in trying to like morph and assimilate into a culture and universe that is mimicking a lot of the dynamics of the trad art world? And I don't feel like that's reconciled, but I do feel like increasingly, there is a desire to kind of impose a lot of the systems of the trad art world. And I think as an artist, what I find difficult about NFTs is sharing and promoting my own work. And I think that's where the idea of the gallery and curators, they play a really important role and alleviate some burden on the artist. But I also think in scenes like what's happening on Solana right now, there's like this really, there's just like a lot of excitement that I think would be disrupted by trying to like impose certain structures. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think to speak to your question about differences between the chains, I think there's interesting cultural ones and there's interesting structural ones. Like Ethereum is technically more interesting. You can do way more things with it. If you're making art that engages with the blockchain on a structural level, you have way more versatility working with Ethereum. Solana, I always joke that Solana is like NASCAR and Ethereum's like F1. But I think that's also like, Solana's a crass place, right? Like you have, like, it's the home of meme coins and everyone knows you're like, oh, fart coin, pussy in bio, like whatever it is. Like these things operate on like the lowest hanging fruit of attention economies, which is cool and exciting. Like, to me, that reveals really deep truths. Like, there were days last summer when Pump Fun trumped the entire volume of what was happening on the entire Ethereum network those days, which is an interesting thing to think about when you have these different camps in crypto where people say, oh, so there's this kind of ivory tower potential of it. You have like, oh, Ethereum Foundation ideas about public goods, this kind of stuff. And then if you look at what the traffic is doing, it's hyper gambling. And I think that's like, the art reflects that. I think about projects in the contemporary art world, like you have something like Judd, which looks more like, I think a lot of the work on Ethereum, it's cleaner. I mean, you can obviously point at exceptions, but then you think about things like, that's like a really sloppy comparison to compare it to something like modernism or minimalism or something like this, but you get the vibe. And then Solana, you could, like, I don't know if anyone knows Leela Dare here, but this is an artist that photographed his mother as a prostitute having sex with Johns. Like, it's like crass, but it's real. And I think Solana, I think a lot of artists are interested in perversity. And I don't mean that sexually. I mean that more like something that's uncomfortable to look at about humanity, exciting to look at about humanity because it is dirty or it is, I don't know. You get what I'm getting at. I don't really want to rest on that word. But yeah, I think Solana, the scene there, and like the culture of the chain generally plays with those variables more.
Okay, great. We're running a little short on time, so I'm just let's keep the questions a little shorter than we've been doing. But if we move on to the next section, which is digital art ecosystems, I guess actually this was like, let's move on to the next one, because that was sort of, I think, covered broadly in your last two talks about Ethereum and Solana. How do you know if a certain project is successful, and what are some projects you admire?
Admire?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting idea, successful, because we're obviously in this sort of financialized environment, right? So it feels really good to mint out, and as much as you tell yourself it doesn't matter if you don't, it's not an awesome feeling. But I think that's also the reality. Like in 2021, you could do anything and it'd mint out pretty instantly, and you could charge a lot for it. Someone say, okay, it's $5K per NFT. People would be like, oh, well, maybe this is a Beeple. I don't really know. Maybe this is the next one of those things. And now, a ton of artists, I think, it brings a bunch of interesting things into question. Like in 2021, there was this expectation that an artist would be maintaining their project for the rest of their life. If you're an artist, that's not really realistic because you love doing new stuff all the time. So, and from an investor standpoint, that's dilutive. Like if Apple was constantly like, oh, we're putting out this new phone, but it's actually on a different company name, all the shareholders would be furious, you know what I mean? And that's basically what you're doing.
Yeah, I think successful is really funny because there is this extreme transparency when you release an NFT project, like this idea of minting out, that is really specific to NFTs. Like if you have a collection and you release it and like whatever, there's 1,000 editions in it, it's immediately obvious how successful in terms of like number of editions collected that your collection was. I find that aspect of making NFTs extremely stressful and anxiety-inducing. It's like the worst part of it for me. But I think also there's sort of this, I don't know, I think of it actually like as really analogous to like fandom and musicians in the way that like musicians operate by like selling a lot of tickets to a concert. And there's like a whole scene around them and like people are participating, and I think that part of it is really exciting. But I think how do you know if a certain project is interesting? It's so personal, but for me, I honestly think I'm not personally interested in most NFT projects, and I think for a project to be really compelling, it has to kind of, I'm really interested in work that's engaging with like popular culture and contemporary culture in some ways. And so I think also at the end of the day, like what an NFT is just like a contract. It's like a certificate for the work, and so people can make anything. And so then I think you just have to sort of become your own, you just have to curate what you're interested in the space. And I think it is frustrating also because for like people in the world, what they think of as an NFT is like the Beeple everydays or like CryptoPunks or and that's like one really like surface layer of what NFTs are. And so I think there's a lot of exciting work happening, but people have to dig a bit deeper than that.
For me, I'm going to reframe success, I guess, as a curator, being about what's good for the artist. And so there's two artists I know and admire who have been kind of got their start in the scene, Diana Sinclair and Tyler Blent Welsh. But they've both kind of morphed their practice to be outside of just digital art. So they're working in photography. One is Tintype, Tyler, and the other one is Cyanotype, which is Diana, among other mediums. And I find the fact that they're both young artists and they've maintained a practice that allows central themes such as, Blackness and representation to find expression across different mediums. To me, that's success for an artist.
think one other thing about it, to speak to what you said, Maya, about doing everything on a transparent ledger, I think one thing that's really interesting there, and I always tell artists, if you want to play this game, you have to be willing to eat shit publicly. And what I mean by that is the trad art world has tremendous market manipulation. And if you look at, like auction results are rigged like crazy if you're working with a decent gallery. With trad artists that have enormous careers, like I used to work for Jenny Holzer, and arguably the most successful female trad artist in the last 50 years. Both her, I'm friends with her daughter. There were years when she didn't have heat in the winter, and and she still has this huge career. And those were mid-career years, it wasn't like those were before she did a show. And if that occurred on a transparent ledger, it'd be really easy to say like, oh, this shit's over, this is cooked. But because the gallery can be like, no, we're keeping the inventory a secret. We're gonna wait and we're gonna cabal this shit with a group of your best collectors. We're gonna collude with them, and we're not gonna put this on the market until your next significant museum show. You can protect people that way, and I think that's important. In 2021, you had all these people coming in that really didn't care about the art. And I think now, for you to be in the space, like the gains just aren't that significant. You have to love the art. And say it from the artist and the collector perspective. You have to kind of understand, like, that is not everything, and it's also not indicative of what the value of these things will be in the future, nor the value of it beyond its current highest bid.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like Makayla is saying, like, artists like Diana and Tyler and artists who maybe like were like very young and started making their first work as NFTs, like the most important, it's you're gonna have a moment, everyone has a moment in their career that it just like, you don't mint out, or like you feel like things aren't going at the momentum that they once were. But I think it's important to really, like, you just have to keep making work. But in the NFT scene, that is so hard when everyone can see everything. And so I think also like artists who maybe started that way, but then also like kind of have other like pockets of their practice, it's nice to have that. Otherwise, it feels too much, like it's too much in one place for me.
Yeah, I also think what you were talking about speaks to the defiance and the energy you were sensing earlier in digital art, because I think artists were sick of the scarcity of demand and the sort of inflation that was going on and the way that it was controlled. And so there was the idea that like blockchain could be liberating.
Yeah. I think that was a real, I think that was like a utopian ideal.
Yeah.
And
it was like ferocious, being like a 12-year-old selling shit.
Which there always is, like tech is always conflated with manifest destiny. Web 1.0, Web 2.0, Web 3.0. It's like this new frontier where we can all be ourselves and not ourselves.
Yeah.
Until market comes in.
Exactly. And I feel like a lot of people have become kind of disillusioned with this idea that like making distributed work is going to alleviate a lot of the issues that were present in a market or in, And I think also this idea of distribution, I think for an artist, there's like, it actually, rather than resulting in distribution of a network, which in some ways it does with the like community aspect, there becomes this like hyper centralization of the role of the artist when you make NFTs, because you kind of have to do every piece of it. And like we're talking about being on Twitter and promoting your work and everything. And I think that part kind of hasn't been figured out long term, because there are going to be like, if you're the only person who's kind of making the work and promoting the work and doing every single piece of labor in the ecosystem of trying to like share your work and have a career, you're going to burn out from it.
And you got to think about your digital cultural legacy.
Yeah.
Like, we're not all going to live forever.
Yeah.
Like how many, like someone probably just got hit by a bus and now their wallet's unavailable and like all this wealth.
Yeah, that's true.
You know?
Yeah.
Not to be dark, but how are we on time?
Great. I think we're about out of time, but thank you all so much for coming.
That's